Welcome to our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Allow Us to Explain. My name is Jordan, and I'm your host for this wonderful little conversation we're going to have today. Joining me today is our Director of Community Events and also next member of our core content team, Tania. Tania, wanted to introduce yourself to everyone here.
Hi, y'all. As Jordan said, I'm Director of Community Events here at our National Conversation, and my motto is, when you know better, you do better.
Heck yeah. And if our voices sound familiar, no, this is not an episode of the Weekly Roundup. You can check that out over on Spotify and your other podcast streaming apps whenever you want to. We're now taking this to Allow Us to Explain. Tanya and I are hitting the road when it comes to this podcast team. Woohoo! All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of today's episode of Allow Us to Explain. Today, we are recording this on November 4th, but November 7th marks Election Day 2023. Woohoo! And then some cool little stats that I found out to kind of lead into our little discussion today. A year from tomorrow, November 5th, it's Election Day 2024. That's the big date for everyone to keep in mind about. And then 4 months from tomorrow, March 5th, it's the start of primary season. So primary season, a big time of year, especially when a presidential race is at stake. So we're going to talk about what are primaries and the importance of primaries nowadays, and also kind of how that ties into voting and how you at home are concerned about certain topics. If you think is a certain good time to start voting, what you think of it. So let's jump right into it. So Tanya, I'm going to give you the floor for this one, just to kind of break it all down first, just get right into it. What do you think of primaries? Do you feel that they're important?
You know what? The breakdown of election systems is so complex. The system is disjointed, complex, and long, right? The founding fathers wrote down the procedure for electing the president, but not how to nominate a presidential candidate, which is why we have these primaries that give states the ability to see who the people want to see running for the popular parties. And the popular parties are Democrats and Republicans, unfortunately, right? There's not really open ground for any other party other than those two. And as you said, states hold primaries 6 to 9 months before presidential election. And these are a very important step of the election process, since they influence the election process by illustrating who the eventual nominee is and what the concerns are of the American people. So they do play a very important place in our overall election system. And primaries, though, not everyone gets to vote in them, right? You have to be a registered voter. You have to have aligned yourself to one of the two political parties, right? Not all libertarians, Green parties can vote in the primary ones. They have open primaries or closed ones. So it really doesn't always reflect what the voters want unless you are going out of your way to vote in those primaries, and you have gone out of your way to align yourself within being Democratic or being Republican, right? And when we think of primaries, we think of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, because Iowa and New Hampshire hold the first caucus and primary election, while South Carolina holds the first Southern state to hold a primary election. And again, they show what Southerners are viewing, who they want to be in the presidential election, and how those in the North, East and West would want to have as their elect potential nominee, right? But it also sheds a light into how the young voters are leaning towards, right? What the quote unquote most powerful voting age group wants to see in this upcoming 2024 election. So they're very important. I think it could be less complex, it could be more accessible, and I wish there was more information for the American public to see how they can use this to influence the policy cycle and the election process. But we don't really see this because it's governed so heavily by either the Democrats or the Republicans that they're not really opening the floor for the Libertarians, the Green Party, right? Or even the Forward Party, right? We don't really see that in the mainstream.
You mentioned Iowa, you mentioned New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the state I would call, let's say, trending at the moment because of their decision to not put Joe Biden on the ballot for the primary. Reasons I've seen online and read about on the news kind of going into the why, when primaries are held type of thing. Before we even get into that, Tania, as someone who can know in previous conversations and also on Weekly Roundup, we discussed that you're more so down the middle when it comes to moderate and everything. That do you think not having your name on the ballot really impacts your election? Because in the past, we've seen other candidates where if they are writing ballots, they've either had successful campaigns afterwards or they've had not so successful ones. An example being LBJ years ago. He was a write-in and then days after dropped out, which obviously I don't think is going to be happening this time around. But what do you think? Do you think having your name on the ballot further benefits you in the primary or having it off, hurts it?
I do think it benefits you a lot. This is a potential risk for our current president, Joe Biden, right? It gives this idea like, oh, is he or is he not going to run? Should I be focusing, like if I was a Democrat, should I be focusing my attention to other potential Dems? Should I be giving them money? Should I be giving them support as opposed to Joe Biden? So this does run a potential risk, but because he is the president, it's kind of unsaid that he will run until he says he won't run, right? But I do think this is him, it kind of reflects his thinking process, right? Of whether or not he actually wants to run, or if he just has too much faith in the Democratic voters, right? Because while he assumes they're going to be on his side, we're seeing more and more polls come out that they don't trust him, and his approval rating is at a historic low for him, right? So this could run a risk for him, but I do think it's very powerful just to have your name on there because it shows that people know you. People want to vote for you, that you think you are a good candidate and a good a competitor, right? So I do think it's very powerful in itself, both being symbolic, but also in just making people aware of who you are and what your platform is.
Absolutely. And so now there are other states where they're debating when to hold their primaries because they have the date set in stone, but then some states are like, we want to push it earlier or we want to push it later, etc. Is there, I guess I'd call it a quote unquote sweet spot time that you think is best to start considering the primaries or voting the primaries? Is it got to be on a nationwide scale or what you view as either the blue or red states, even purple states? When do you think it's the best time to actually start considering voting in the primaries?
So that's the actually very interesting part of primaries, right? Because our founding fathers never wrote down that process. It's been up to the states to make their own decision. So states have this great power to say, oh, we're going to be either later or earlier, and that's going to influence the election process. So right-leaning states could make it later in the game or earlier in the game that could affect Biden's ability to be competitive, right? So in terms of having like a sweet spot, like a federal date or like a universal date, I just don't know. I don't know there is one. I probably November, 6 to 9 months before the actual election where we all voting on not I don't want to say one day, but probably within that week. Everyone within that week can go and vote. If they're a registered voter, of course, you have to be a registered voter to vote in these primaries. And then again, having just a week to do that rather than a day to vote could be really great and really increase voter turnout and increase our trust in government to make voting more accessible. So I would say I don't have a particular date, but I have like a week in mind of voting processes, right?
As a journalist in the room, I can only imagine how that would look in the newsroom to have a week of just primaries and then a few months after the fact uh, go into election day coverage. No, that's an interesting take, and I think it could be something to consider. But I want to go back to your statement on powers. You said giving voters enough power to actually, use their knowledge and everything to vote. More young people are starting to vote nowadays. There was high voter turnout among younger voters in 2020, where basically over half of those who were 18 and 19 years old turned out. This was an increase from the election beforehand. So we're starting to see this trend kind of come about when it comes to young voters. So why do you think more young people are starting to vote? And two, do you think young people even care about the primaries? Or do you think their attention is more so on the general election come November?
Those are some good questions, Jordan, right? I we don't see a lot of young voter turnout in primaries, right? And this is mostly because they have lost faith in the overall election process. So because of that, they're not voting, or because they're not a registered Democrat or they're not a registered Republican, they have no ability to vote unless they're registering as one of those they don't typically align with, right? Maybe they're libertarian, maybe they're Green Party. All right. And they could vote in more open primaries, but that still is secluding particular political beliefs and values, right? If it were more open and you just had to be an overall registered voter, you didn't have to pick a party, I do think we can see more turnout. But I think at the end of the day, it's because there's not a lot of information available for primaries, right? The process of getting yourself into there as a secret voter to throw that secret ballot, the process is hard to come by, right? Unless you're in thick of it, right? And overall, just the awareness of just how impactful primaries are. Because we only talk about Iowa, we only talk about New Hampshire, we only talk about South Carolina. We're not talking about the primaries we have in our own home states that will influence the electoral process, right? Now, do young voters even want to vote anyway? I think there's been a shift since 2017, right? A lot of young, since President Trump or ex-President Trump came into office, there has been a shift where you've seen more young voters becoming revitalized, saying, oh, I know what I don't want in a president. I know what I do want in a president, right? So you're seeing these hyper politicalization of young adults, right? Which could be a good thing and a bad thing at the same time, because you have to question if the information they're digesting is accurate, or is it too appeasing of one side as opposed to really looking at the root of the problem, right? Which is why ONC exists, to get to the root of the problem, right? To showcase to the young voters. You don't have to be just looking at liberal media or conservative media. There is a middle ground that's getting to the core of the issue. And I don't think young voters really care about that, or they just want to feed into their own pleasure sensors in the brain. It's, oh yes, this is very left-leaning media, this very conservative leaning media, let me just digest this. So it does impact on the day their turnout, right? Because they can have their political leaders saying, hey, the election is false anyway, your vote doesn't matter. So then they're not voting, right? And that really affects how they perceive the government and our elected officials. But I am hopeful this coming primary season and election, we will see an increase in young voter turnout because of how more accessible voting is and just how much chaos there's been in the US, right? Not anyone likes to call that a chaos, but it has been very chaotic under Trump and under Biden, right? So I think we see more people willing to vote and go out of their way to find out more information on how to secure the vote. But in terms of primaries, I don't know. I don't think they have that information ready for them.
And I want to go back to a point that you made about how young people are kind of, I guess, turned off a little bit with voting because they don't quote unquote trust the electoral system. So let's dive into that for a second. What, because obviously we're both members of Gen Z. So what do you think are the reasons why young people don't trust the electoral process?
The electoral college is both perceived as the prime method of illustrating what the voters want, but also it's not, because it's looking, obviously it looks, has the popular vote in there, but it also looks at the electoral college votes that candidates get, right? Which doesn't always reflect what the American people want, right? One candidate can win a state with a really high number of electoral votes, but the people in that state don't like him, or like people in other states don't like him, but he has the most votes, so therefore he's president, right? A lot of our presidents past who have had high popular votes, or sorry, haven't had high popularity among voters, still won the presidency because they had high electoral college votes for them, right? So I think because of that very instance and how the electoral college works, that there is a decreased trust in the voting process, right? But I also think it comes down to, again, the accessibility of voting. It's always going to come down to that, because while the greatest contribution to democracy that the popular political parties have done is expanding voter rights, it doesn't really mean everyone's going to vote or care enough to vote, but also it doesn't mean that voting is accessible because of that. It doesn't mean that the actions we're doing if it's promoting bad faith or not bad faith, right? It's a mix of perceptions, right? You want to have people having trust in the electoral process and the electoral college, because that's all we have. So if they don't have faith in it, they're just not going to vote, right? But there are alternatives being casted for electoral college, but those themselves are flawed, right? So all we really have to rely on is the current process we have now, because the other choices, the other alternatives are just as chaotic, just as complex, right? What do you think of it, Jordan?
I think it's definitely, as you said, it can have its problems, as you said, because I remember clearly being in high school. It might have also been in college a little bit as well. Not so much maybe in college, but in high school, I remember specifically, that's when the big uproar with the electoral college came out, because it was that year. I think it was Clinton won the popular vote, yet Trump won the electoral college, and so that's why he got elected. I think it was. I think that was yeah. I think it was like a sophomore high school when that came out. I remember that's when like everyone in my classes like up in arms, like they should abolish electoral college. Da, da, da. So, or like there needs to be some other alternative. Like we can't do this anymore. Da, da, da. I remember like it went around the high school for a good maybe like month or like for a while, because even though we were too young to vote at the time, for those who were in my sophomore class, still very much affected us, just because 2 years from that point it was going to be us at the ballots for our own races that we were like before. That was probably the gubernatorial race and everything at that time. Should the electoral college, you think right now, for young voters especially, as more young voters are starting to get older and get more active in their political practices when it comes to voting, should the electoral college still exist in the future? Or if not, what do you think the electoral process should look like for you and your peers as you get older and you get through this voting process?
Yeah, I mean, we're so used to the electoral college is the only process that we know of. We're so used to decide its flaws. So I'm so used to it. So the other alternatives, I'm just as critical on, right? The one everyone goes to is ranked choice voting, but that in itself can be problematic in sense of, again, accessibility. I'm always going to throw that word in. We're talking about voting and the presidential process, right? It's going to come down to how states make the voting process accessible, because there are states that have certain regulations and rules and lawsuits right now that are preventing voters from voting and that are excluding a certain demographic from voting, right? So there's so much controversy, and I think having a change within this century isn't going to work in our favor in terms of increasing voter turnout and increasing trust in the government, right? And the perception of electoral colleges really shifts depending on who wins the presidential nomination, right? If the Dems win, they're so happy. Oh my God, the electoral college is so good. If they lose, they're like, oh my God, it's so flawed. And the same thing for Republicans, right? So there's this shifting perception of it. But in the very middle of that issue is the fact that the electoral college doesn't always reflect the wants or the needs of the American people, right? And that's the core issue. So if we can find a system that is reflective of that and is having proper mechanisms in place to make sure people are having the ability to vote and have the ability to understand the voting process and the candidates' platforms and information they're giving to them, then it'll be more, we can see an increase of trust, right? But I don't have a particular preference. I guess my preference is the electoral college, because while it's flawed, we're just so used to it, right? And I don't like the other options because they're just as problematic. So might as well stay with the system we know so well, but we can introduce mechanisms to check against states who are preventing the voting process and check against people themselves who are trying to hawk down people who they are against from voting, right? So we need to have those mechanisms in place. We need to protect voter rights and voting security.
Now let's talk about the views of the American people, just because obviously primary season is a good time for any major candidate, really, or in the smaller candidates to really get out there onto the campaign trail and, talk about what they believe is right or wrong when it comes to certain topics that are impacting the American people, try to level with their constituents, their potential voters, their potential supporters. What are some of the, I guess, big topics that you think are important for any candidate, no matter how big or small they are when it comes to the race? What are some of the big topics that you think are important for them to address during the primary season?
I think these potential nominees, one, are coming from my own perspective, right? They're not really representing everyone. But I do think the hard-hitting concerns or questions has to do with, of course, immigration, has to do with our debt, it has to do with our foreign policy, particularly when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, Iran, to now Israel, and now to Ukraine, right? Those are some concerns when it comes to foreign policy that I'm mentioning. There are other concerns that we can go into deeper detail about. But then bringing the focus back down to domestic policy concerns, again, debt, education, comes down to health initiatives. What are we doing for the people? And then just how are we just improving the social well-being of others, right? That's some of the big concerns I do see coming out, but also I do see a big concern coming out on election integrity, right? How can these candidates affirm the election results and integrity? How can they protect us from outsiders who want to, I'm trying to think of the word for it, but trying to intervene in our election process, right? Because there's this perception that some foreign agents who are influencing our American electoral process. So what are they doing to prevent that? What are their concerns on that, right? Because we're so deep in this belief that there is some conspiracy going on for the voting process. So those are some domestic concerns I see, but some of the international has to do with China, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, Israel, all of those things. But those are some of the ones I think. What about yourself?
I think you hit the nail on when it comes to those. I think also another big one, the climate. That's a huge issue right now. Because just no matter where you live right now, the climate is, what's the word I'm looking for? Atypical, I guess, right now when it comes to certain stuff. Just because from my own perception. I went to California during their fall season. The day I went, it was 95 degrees. So I was like, climate change. Or up here in Buffalo, I was literally wearing short sleeve shirts out and about without a coat on a week or so ago, when typically I'd be bundled up like it's Antarctica outside. So interesting perception when it comes to that topic right there. But going on that topic, and also on a few that you mentioned, foreign affairs, huge issue right now. I don't need to go into why, just because if you listen to the news, you understand why. And also immigration, as you mentioned as well. How do you think candidates' views on those three major topics, how do you think that either, to kind of break it down to kind of young people, Gen Z speak, makes or breaks their campaign when it comes to either going with what the young people want or going against what the younger people want? What do you have to say about that when it comes to those three primary issues right there?
Yeah, in terms of immigration, I think young voters don't like the wishy-washiness of our current political leaders, right? If you're going to say one thing, stick with it. Don't go dial back because you're afraid of the results it's going to have, right? A lot of young voters have referenced Biden's immigration plan or his procedures, right? Biden has been working to reverse Trump-era restrictions on immigration to the United States, but he's also refunded the wall project, right? So this apparent wishy-washiness doesn't sit well with young Democrat voters, right? Who are like, oh, Biden is supposed to be pro-immigration, opening the borders, but here he is in a way closing down the borders by making it harder or more unsafe for immigrants to come across the border, right? So there's that perception of the wishy-washiness when it comes to the immigration policy that people don't quite like. Even Republicans, they don't quite like it. They're confused. They're like, should we applaud him or should we say there's something going on, a controversy? There's something happening in the background that we don't know of, right? Which creates this bad perception of the government. But you did hit it before we got into this conversation. You hit an interesting point on climate change, right? A lot of people don't always believe in climate change, but they do believe in climate resistance, climate resilience, right? So our infrastructure is in resistance when it comes to natural disasters, right? And that comes down to the fact that our infrastructure isn't competitive with the changing temperatures going around us. And if we don't believe in climate change, we do believe we can jointly all agree that our current infrastructure is not up to date and it's not going to last long against hurricanes, against floods, against earthquakes. So we must be doing all that we can to reinvest in infrastructure, right? So again, I think candidates can be smarter when it comes to talking about climate change and talking about climate resilience, right? Because not everyone believes in climate change, and it's a drag to try to convince someone who is so unconvinced of climate change, even if there are facts, because the data is there to showcase there is an increasing trend of infrequent weather patterns, right? It's October. Not October, it's November in California, and it's 85 degrees. That does not make sense at all, right? We get random rain, we get little floods here and there, and we're so not used to it. Our infrastructure is so not used to it. So I think it would be smart if candidates would make that shift for climate resistance or climate resilient infrastructure or climate resilient discussions, right? Because it's encapsulating, right? It's showcasing that we're taking in consideration the difficult weather patterns, but also we're not feeding into like the left-leaning mind, we're also feeding into the right-leaning mind, we're going in the middle in a way, but going back to immigration before I go into a whole different spiel, right? Because this information is so interesting, right? But young voters now are more accepting of immigration, right? They're more welcoming to this procedures of welcoming migrants. But there is an underlying concern of, do we have the Social Security blanket to cover them? If we welcome them, are we just going to be like, okay, you're here, bye, and then they're off to defend themselves? They're not going to have the proper mechanisms to get a job, to learn the language if they don't know it already, and to become citizens that are active in our democracy, right? And that's also a concern conservatives have with immigration. If we welcome them here, how can they be self-sufficient, right? Because most immigrants, when they come into here, are not self-sufficient. They have to learn the language. They have to learn how to feel secure and safe here. And if we don't have proper social care programs readily for them to get them ready and up to date with everything, they're not going to become active citizens in our democracy. And when I say active citizens in our democracy, I mean, are they really going to feed into our economy? Are we really going to see the benefits of having immigrants? Because we really don't see the bigger impact across the board of immigrants in our country, right? And that's because we don't have enough social care programs to provide them the benefits they need, right? So there is this other discussion on increasing the social safety net. So not only is it protecting immigrants, but also protecting Americans who are born here, right?
And do you think, or what are some issues that you wish were discussed more during this time? Because as we get deeper into it, that's when we get the wider net of issues. But during primary season, what are some issues that you wish were discussed more, especially as a young voter?
I guess I wish I'd see more criticism towards political leaders, right? And I guess it's like intersectional way. I really appreciate intersectional politics, how we discuss how one policy has an effect in several different other realms. And I think that's more things I would like to see. But in particular issues, gosh, there's, I think, a whole lot of things are the personal is political, right? For me, I'm a brown woman in the United States. I want to see how policies are going to affirm my safety in the United States, because so far I don't feel safe. I know I know it's not like the 40s. I'm not going to get lynched. I know that. I'm not going to get like severely hate crime every now and then, but not hate crime to the extent it was back then. And that makes me a bit cautious about my surroundings, right? I still get called the N-word here in my own community. So that tells me that my safety isn't being affirmed and people are not caring. So I want to see politicians talk about that, talk about how we still are seeing this division among brown, black, white, Asian Americans, right? And can we talk about policy or talk about or have a conversation how to prevent this type of thing happening in the future? Because the United States is too damn old to have these things still happen. We're such a melting pot now, and to have people like this here, I'm like, grow up. I'm so sorry, but grow up. You're too old to be having this perception. But also politicians need to be able to call out other Americans saying, hey, if you're racist, burn. I don't know what to say. I guess I want to see more of that. I also want to see politicians call out their own popular party, right? Call out your fellow Republican candidates, call out your fellow Democrat candidates. Be confrontational when it comes to that, because that tells me that you're there for me, right? You're not trying to appease your own political party. You're looking to appease me, the voter.
And touching upon the age concern, as you mentioned, just because, as you mentioned, or one of your stronger statements was, you were, quote, way too old to be doing stuff like that in this day and age. So when it comes to this, age divide, do you think the primaries help voters like you choose who they want to see run and represent their party in the big major election? Or do you think they help older folks out more?
I would say older voters know more about this process than younger voters do. And older voters are more likely to have assigned themselves to one of the popular political parties, right? Me, myself, I'm not under a registered party. So I can only vote in the primary if it's an open one, not a closed one. So that really prevents my ability to get a candidate I want, right? Because I'm not there, because I do consider myself a moderate, right? But in order to vote, you have to be registered with the political party. So it's so distorted, right? but it is older people we're going to see more voting in these elections. And it is those with very hyper education or hyper wealth, or those, we're not really seeing blue collar workers in there. We're not really seeing those who only did high school, right? Because either they don't have the time to go because it's not accessible. It's one day to go in and vote, right? So it's not accessible in that sense. And information is just not there for them, or they don't understand how impactful that primary voting is, or they don't understand the overall impact they have as a voter in the electoral process, right? I think a lot of Americans are undermining their own political power. They forget that they are a weapon, they are a tool in this process. And I really wish we can enlighten that passion voters had way back then, right? Because not all voters now know all information, right? And that comes down to how the media represents information. It comes down to how much they trust the information being given to them, right? So obviously you need that shift, right, on them consuming information that is not so heavily partisan, right? Get information that is looking at everything and at everyone, right? So there's that from my perspective, at least.
To kind of round out this conversation, what do you think, if any, needs to change to get folks of all ages, young to old, to care about primaries and primary season, and just upcoming elections in general, no matter how small or big they may be?
Same people, younger people especially, because I am young people, I am Gen Z, right? That's where having this particular focus, right? To get them more interested, and they just have to have the information there for them, right? Not all young people, Gen Z in particular, know about primaries or understand that they can be in there. Like they do have an impact in this, because there's this sort of idea like, oh, if I vote just in an actual election, my vote matters. Yeah, your vote matters, but you have a greater impact if you're there in the primaries. Because what if you don't want Joe Biden? What if you want someone else? You have to be in the voting in that primaries to get the person you want, right? And it also comes down to, again, how accessible it is. It's gonna come down to that. It's always gonna come down to that. Whether or not people have the time, the resources to actually go and vote, right? Because the overall election process is inaccessible in a sense that it doesn't accommodate people's times, right? And I don't think I'm being too left by saying that we need to make voting more open to our registered voters. It seems like common sense. If we want the voting process to showcase all the perception beliefs of American people, we have to make it accessible. And one of those options has been mail-in votes, but that in itself is controversial, right? We really see the controversy highlighted from Trump, right? How he thinks these are fake votes, these are not actual Americans voting, these are frauds, right? But I think those are faux perceptions. There has been no evidence to write any of that. And if there was, then I would be critical of mail-in voting. But there hasn't been any real cases. And I say, I'm emphasizing real, because from what we've seen from the past news cycle, they made up the claims. His own legal counsel did make up claims of election fraud. So as we know of, there is no fraud when it comes to elections so far in terms of mail-in voting. So I do think having mechanisms of mail-in voting makes voting more accessible to those everyday working Americans, right? Because our blue-collar workers need to be prioritized, because they are the ones feeling every single thing the American system is giving, right? They're feeling every policy change. Like that's you and I, Jordan, right? We're not in factories, but we're not like really white collar workers always also, you know what I mean? So we're feeling the greater effects of that. We're feeling those gas prices, okay? $7 for a gallon. And that's in LA. It's ridiculous. So I'm feeling everything. So I guess when it comes down to that, making it more accessible and having my voice actually matter, it's going to have a greater impact and increase our trust in the government and increase voter turnout.
All I'm hearing is accessibility when it comes to getting these changes off the ground. So sweet. So that basically kind of wraps up our conversation. Tanya, like I do on the weekly roundup, I'll give you the final word. Anything else you want to add and say before we go?
I say, despite my own criticism when it comes to the voting process, primaries, and elections, go out to vote. Register now to be a voter and get your voice heard. I'm not coming from a left agenda or right agenda. I'm coming from like a person agenda, right? Get your voice out there. Let politicians know what you want to see talked about and discussed. Go out to your local politicians, your congresswomen, congressmen, senators, representatives, be like, hey, are you representing me? Because these are my concerns, right? Have it be known you are a very powerful tool in this election cycle, and you have to recognize that it's not the elites, it's you at the end of the day. So please register to vote. Please consume media that is not just, tingling your little pleasure center in the brain. Consume media and information that is looking at everything. It's looking at what the left is saying, what the right is saying, what the centrists are saying, so you understand the perspectives and values when it comes to certain issues, so you can come up with an answer that makes sense to you, right? Just don't take what the media tells you, because sometimes the media is going to have a left or right agenda. But you could listen to what ONC says, because we do have a news aggregator that is going to do the work for you. It's going to look at what the left is saying. It's going to look what the right is saying, what the centrists are saying. So you have all the information readily available for you. So please make sure to check it out at our website.
Yes. Make sure you check out our website. Make sure you also follow us on social, stay up to date on everything that's happening here. This airs on election day itself, so happy election day to those who are listening. So thank you all at home for listening. Thank you, Tanya, for participating in this wonderful podcast conversation. Allow Us to Explain will be back next week. You can hear Tanya and I talk more about some of the issues that really matter to all of you later on this week on the Weekly Roundup. So make sure that you're staying up to date on all that on your favorite podcast or streaming platforms. And we'll see you then. Have a good one. This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.